Hello everybody, Aimer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. This time we're going into Season 2 of the revival. It's got some mixed feelings here because, there's not a whole heck of a lot left, but boy, these episodes are fun to talk about, that's for sure. So I'm looking forward to this. So we'll start, of course, with Season 2, Episode 1, which is called The Golden Serpent, and it is a two-parter. So this one starts out in Southeast Asia, with a guy outside a facility deep in a jungle, making voice recordings of himself, infiltrating the place and telling what he's found. Apparently inside the facility, opium is being loaded into torpedo tubes, placed into submarines for delivery. He notes that one of the men in charge seems to be someone named Prince Seleman. Seleman is informed that there seem to be radio transmissions coming nearby and tells his scary henchman Baal to deal with it, as the infiltrator knocks over some dirt and alerts them to his presence. As he takes some pictures, Baal spots him and kills him with a throwing star to the back. Jim gets his instructions in what is apparently Fort Denison in Sydney Harbor, using spy speak. The mission. What we saw is part of the organization known as the Golden Serpent, which is distributing drugs around the world. The dead man was the leader of another IM team. Prince Seleman of Benarli is high up in the organization, and one of the other IM team's people has become part of Seleman's apparatus. The IMF must learn who the leader of the Golden Serpent is, get details on how the organization operates, so that it can be shut down. So the IMF have their increasingly usual impromptu apartment type scene on a boat on the Great Barrier Reef. We're told that the sociopathic Seleman had a twin who drowned when he was 9, and it's believed that Seleman was responsible, but no body was ever found, and the matter was kept quiet. The Golden Serpent has created a consulate on an Australian island for Seleman to use, likely as a cover for operations. Jim tells us right from the beginning that this will be a separate and mislead play, and next we see the agent who's become a mole within the organization, none other than Barney Collier, who oversees a shipment coming in through clever means. The loaded submarine shoots its torpedoes towards the house, and scuba divers go down and bring them up to the processing area, through a grate which Barney opens and closes as necessary. Seleman and Baal come down to have a look, and Seleman tells Baal that his wealth, power, and swanky lifestyle are worth the lives that are lost for the business. Seleman calls his contact, and they both use their neat serpent rings to scramble the transmission, informing him that everything is on schedule. This is followed up with some really dumb dialogue involving the contact's henchman and henchwoman, who is somehow credited as Big Blonde. All this is happening while Seleman is having a party outside the consulate. Grant finds his dad signaling the others in a speedboat and handing him a device which he takes down to the processing area. He distracts the supervisor with a phone call, allowing him to use the device to scan the bottles of heroin that Seleman is hiding in vitamin C bottles, handing it back to Grant later. Shannon is also attending and passes an envelope to the prince, containing a picture of him with his twin brother Jahani, which gets his attention. Shannon tells him that she doesn't want anything from him, she just doesn't want to be killed, starting to tell the story about how Jahani is still alive and two men are using him in some nefarious plan to kill the prince. She acts scared when she sees Jim and Nicholas arrive and dashes off. Grant runs interference briefly so that Shannon can get away with Max on the boat, and Seleman tells Baal to check them all out. Barney's handoff to Grant is caught on Seleman's security cameras, and he gets a somewhat sadistic henchman to set up an elaborate laser to cause Barney severe pain unless he talks. Barney says he works for the organization and they don't trust Seleman, sending him to spy on Seleman. Baal tells Seleman that Jim is apparently a Swiss banker and Nicholas is a drug runner. Shannon's listed at a hotel as Shannon Purcell, but the connection between the three is still a mystery. Seleman figures that Barney has the answers, so gets the henchman to continue the torture. Meanwhile, Grant is using what appears to be some kind of 3D printer in 1989, that's pretty impressive, to duplicate the bottles. With Barney's information, Max has located the transfer area, and a mask is prepared for Nicholas to become Seleman, or Jahani, and he and Jim come to Shannon's hotel, where they stage a conversation strong-arming her into cooperating with them, with Seliman's man watching them. The two men manage to evade Seliman's guy, and he's of course furious about that, but gets Baal to bring Shannon to him. Meanwhile, Barney's torture continues. It's time for Max and Grant to intercept the outgoing shipment, so they head near the transfer grotto, expecting that Barney will open the gate for them at 8 a.m. as discussed. Baal and Shannon arrive while Barney is having heart fibrillations, so the torture has to be stopped for a while, and he's put in a room to rest. Seliman questions Shannon, who says she wants protection from the dangerous men behind the plot. She says that she doesn't know much, but once heard that Jahani plans to take his throne back by killing Seliman, and mentions something about a golden serpent. Barney sees the time and, despite his poor condition, struggles to his feet and distracts the guard so he can get out of the room, smacking him with a heavy pot from behind. He stealthily gets down to the processing area as Max and Grant get to the security gate at 8, and he's able to open them and disable the lasers protecting the opening to the processing area. A guard hits Barney, but Max is able to subdue him and the others with pre-prepared darts. Grant is of course only concerned about his dad, but Barney tells him to finish the mission. He does, alongside Max of course, but after switching the bottles, Grant's only thought is to get his father out to safety, despite his condition and lack of scuba gear. Max hears the elevator and tells Grant they have to go or the mission's blown, and in the same situation, Barney would do the same thing. Grant is anguished beyond all get-up, but realizes that Max is right, and sadly leaves his father behind. Seliman and Baal arrive and survey the situation. Baal activates the laser and closes the gate, and Max and Grant are barely able to get out. Baal figures Barney was trying to escape, but Seliman realizes he couldn't have overpowered two guards by himself. Shannon radios Jim and tells him she's on Seliman's yacht, and the shipment's being loaded. The yacht is heading to Sydney. Seliman comes by, forcing Shannon to drop the radio in the water, claiming it was just a makeup compact. Grant is distraught, and Jim tries to console him, but Grant is righteously bitter about the job taking his father yet again, which it basically did throughout Grant's whole life. Jim says the Barney Collier he knew never had anything taken from him. He gave, and he did it mostly for his son. Despite his mixed feelings, Grant sits at a computer and does his job. He tells the others, his voice breaking, that Seliman will be at a reception at the Sydney Opera House. That's where the IMF head, with Nicholas and Max's workers setting up the stage, and Grant watching from a distance as Seliman's yacht arrives. Shannon plants a bug on the yacht phone as Max climbs up trusses to get onto the Sydney Harbour Bridge across the water to take sniper shots for effect from the planted squibs. Seliman takes the stage, distracted briefly when he sees Jim and Nicholas in the audience. Jim sets off the squibs, Max takes his shots, preparing to make his getaway, but Baal comes by in a helicopter and rappels down to chase him. Nicholas is concerned, of course, but Jim tells him to get moving for the next step. Baal shoots his throwing stars as Max evades him as well as the helicopter chasing him, but Baal is able to hit him in the leg, slowing him down, and Max is forced onto a ledge with Baal above him. Max is somehow able to get the star out of his leg and throw it into Baal's chest, sending him falling into the ocean. He manages to climb back up, but the helicopter comes by and he falls backwards. On to part 2. We get a brief recap, depending on how you're watching this, and then we see that Max had a parachute, so ends up landing in the speedboat piloted by Grant. They find themselves under fire from Seliman's guards, leading them on a cool chase through the harbor where the bad guys end up hitting a pier and the boat explodes, of course. Seliman grabs Shannon and prepares to return to the yacht, but is intercepted by Jim, who brings out Nicholas as Jahani to Seliman's shock. Jahani says he's working with the Golden Serpent, who don't trust Seliman anymore, and unfortunately the sniper missed. Seliman rushes off, leaving Shannon behind, but she runs to catch up. Shannon overhears Seliman's boat captain, who's apparently a confidant, advise him to take the heroin and try to run to safety. Seliman says they would hunt him down. They also discuss Jahani, and Seliman admits that he drowned his brother himself and is sure he is dead. Seliman intends to deliver this shipment and then return to his country where at least he'll be relatively safe among his people. The heroin is loaded into a car. Grant and Nicholas follow with some obligatory silly dialogue. They find, though, that the thieves are smarter than originally thought. The car goes into a roundabout with several identical decoys and gets away. Seliman's contact and his man Burroughs discover that the shipment is actually vitamin C. He calls Seliman with Grant intercepting the call thanks to Shannon's bug, but they scramble the transmission. Seliman accuses the contact of trying to remove him with Jehani's help, and the contact, of course, accuses Seliman of going into business for himself. Both of them, of course, deny the other's accusations. Using previous voice footage of Seliman, Grant is able to find a way to unscramble the transmission and use that information to figure out who's on the other end of the phone. Jim, and Nicholas as Seliman this time, go to his bank and ask to transfer all of his funds to Jim's bank in Switzerland, to the horror of Seliman's banker Harris, who advises him to seriously think about it, but eventually goes through with it. Meanwhile, on Seliman's boat, he's still living the high life, not worried about anything, and Big Blonde has suddenly appeared as one of the yacht babes. Shannon avoids the swimsuit crowd and instead looks around the yacht, finding a locked door and cleverly grabbing a key from one of the guards. Grant learns that the other voice print belongs to Seliman's contact, whose name is Conrad Drago. They find the Swiss account from which he pays the prince and start draining it towards Seliman's accounts. Later, Grant does some interesting 3D rendering work, seemingly of the Golden Serpent's delivery grotto, seemingly full of gold. Drago summons Harris the banker for an explanation of what's going on, but Harris can't provide any details of how it all happened. It just did. Drago tells Burroughs to take poor Harris on a drive, his last one. Drago's next call is a short one. He just says, "Do it, now." One guess, no prize is what that means, as we next see Big Blonde fatally shoot Seliman in the back, taking his serpent ring and throwing him overboard, as the boat captain looks on in horror, realizing he's got a new boss. Big Blonde tells the yacht babes, including Shannon, who has joined the swimsuit crowd, that Drago's running things and to forget Seliman. Shannon opens the locked door and within, to her surprise, finds Barney Collier being kept alive for information. He wants her to tell Grant he's alive, but she says she can't communicate with the team right now, but will be back later to check on him. Grant, meanwhile, outfits Nick with a tiny camera and transmitter for the next step, contacting Drago as Cortez, indicating that he bought the prince's heroin, and Jim tells Drago they're willing to sell it back to him for $5 million, a fraction of its street value, and arrange a meeting place where they do the usual let's see each other's goods thing, and in the end, Burroughs, of course, prepares to shoot Nicholas, but Nicholas then tells him to keep the money. It's a gift. Surprising and at the same time confusing Burroughs, but of course he takes the money and the drugs. Max and Grant head back towards the Golden Serpent facility to set up for the ending, as Nicholas and Jim visit Drago, who explained that the gift was in anticipation of buying his operation, amusing Drago, until they explain that his operation is seriously devalued right now, and he can't sustain it. Burroughs wonders why, in that case, they're even interested in it, and Nicholas says that they have valuable contacts and distribution, and that's what he wants. Drago wonders where in the world they will come up with the money to buy the Golden Serpent, and they tell him it'll come from Seliman. But Drago says Seliman's dead. Jim retorts that his gold isn't gone, and they know where it is. Drago doesn't like being strong-armed, but realizes he doesn't have very many options, so he agrees. Max infiltrates the facility grounds, dressed as one of the guards, spots Barney being brought in, rescuing him by gassing the guard, and bringing him into the building. Drago arrives with Jim and Nicholas by helicopter, and Shannon joins Max and Barney in one of the rooms, allowing Barney to tell Grant that he's okay. Drago demands to get the gold before he turns over any information, and Jim tells him the gold is already here in the receiving dock grotto. Grant dives into the water, heading towards the facility as well, as Max, Barney, and Shannon head down to the processing area and subdue the guards there, starting some preparation, disabling the lasers, and opening the outer grate. Grant sets up a device in the grotto alongside his real gold bar and surfaces, reuniting with his father briefly before going down again, so that Barney can reset the lasers and grate. Shannon intercepts Drago and the others coming down the elevator, with Jim explaining that she's his associate, Ms. Purcell, bothering Big Blonde, who wonders why she seems to be all over the place. But Jim spins the yarn that he originally thought that Seliman ran the organization, until Shannon discovered the truth about it. And Seliman was robbing Drago blind. Then Harris turned them on to Drago. After this somewhat sensible explanation, Drago tells Big Blonde to stand down. When the crew get downstairs to the grotto, Shannon and Jim put on a bit of a show, leading to guard Max pointing out a hidden area in the water with an overwhelming gleam of gold. The lasers are turned off and Max dives in to retrieve the real gold bar, convincing Drago that the stash is actually there. Using the 2 Serpent rings, Drago reveals a hidden computer with all of the organization's information, and Nicholas's camera relays all of the information to Grant's computer. It wouldn't be the revival series, though, if Drago didn't pull a double cross, saying he'll keep the gold and the organization. So Big Blonde readies her crossbow again, aiming at Jim, but Barney pushes him out of the way and takes the shot. Shannon pushes Big Blonde into the water for the obligatory cat fight, and Max, for some bizarre reason, seems to have some difficulty subduing Drago. But of course, both agents end up okay. Jim pulls the crossbow bolt out, and Nicholas gets Shannon out of the water, but Big Blonde still's got her crossbow, and Nicholas is barely able to get Shannon out of its way. It ends up hitting the on button for the laser, so Big Blonde gets to take the Disney villain death in this one. Inexplicably, and I mean that in the literal sense, there is no explanation for this. The entire computer system starts to overload and a fire breaks out. I guess Big Blonde was just really that smoking hot, like, whatever. The episode turns into a Michael Bay production with fiery explosions all over the place. The IMF head up in the elevator, Drago's trapped under the rubble, and we get a final shot of the Serpent ring as he dies. Grant brings the IMF boat to the pier as the guards disperse, and the IMF face no resistance as they head to the boat and get away from the impending inferno as the entire building collapses. Barney starts to recover, and he and Jim have a nice scene, as do he and Grant. We get the lame one-liner, and the IMF sails away into the sunset, with Shannon and Max still wearing their wet clothes for some reason. Mission accomplished. This is another really tough episode to grade, as there's so much going on that needs to be discussed. So I'm going to talk it out before giving my grade. I'm also going to be going back and forth quite a bit on the good and the bad, because there's so much overlap in terms of the content here, where, you know, the only way I can make any sense out of discussing and reviewing this episode is that way. I have to talk about it in chunks, and I've commented before about how every season of Mission Impossible, revival or original series, is a mixed bag. And nowhere is that more apparent than in this episode. There's such a mixed bag of a whole bunch of things here. So stay with me on this, because I think this is a really interesting episode to discuss, and I hope that I'm going to do it justice. Let me start with the callback, which is usually what I end with. And I'm trying to think of what episodes, this kind of calls back to. This one is unique in a lot of ways because it was really difficult. Maybe because of that closing sequence, it reminded me a little bit of the bunker from back in season 3. But more so, it reminded me of the council in season 2. If you recall that one, where they turned it into a movie, mostly for European audiences, called Mission Impossible versus the Mob. And when I see this again, the more I think, man, they really structured this as if it were like a made-for-TV movie. Frankly, I think that there might have been some thought given to that, either consciously or subconsciously, amongst the producers and the writers. This was a season premiere, so they needed to kind of start the season with a bang, pun intended, as I'll talk about more. And it's interesting in that way that, this is a bit off the wall, really, in terms of the way the show normally is. Starting off with some weirdness in terms of what the IMF is actually really all about. In this one, there's talk about IM teams, IM research. The organization seems to have expanded in some kind of weird way. We already had from last season talk about, IM teams for, MI6, British intelligence, that sort of thing, in the episode Spy. And interestingly, the voice on tape, and we're gonna have to keep an eye on this as season 2 goes on, because I honestly don't remember. The voice on tape in this one calls the Jim's group the IM team rather than the IM force. And I'm really not sure where they were going with that. Maybe they had optimism, that the show would keep going and they could expand the Mission Impossible universe, so to speak. I'm guessing that might have been where they were going. I also found it a little bit weird that Barney ends up on some other IM team. Why isn't he on Jim's team? That's what I originally thought. I guess you could argue that Jim's team was kind of full, and, they already have an electronics expert with Grant, who's, pretty much just as good as his dad. Or there might be some kind of conflict of interest there, having family members on the same team. I don't know. I don't know whether it's weird or interesting or both that the writers and producers kind of went in this direction. Interesting in this episode, quite unusual too, that the IMF in most cases use their real first names, but fake last names. Shannon becomes Shannon Purcell. Nicholas becomes Nicholas Cortez. Jim becomes James Stryker, which was a little bit off the wall there too. I really don't quite know what to make of that. One other thing I found weird about that, in terms of the whole IM thing, in the beginning we see the fellow doing recon work, to track Selemon's operation. And then the voice on tape says that was actually the team leader, which is really weird. Shouldn't one of the team be doing the reconnaissance work? Why would a team leader be put in that kind of, dangerous situation? It really doesn't make sense. And apparently Barney was a part of this guy's team. It might have even made more sense to have Barney be the team leader, given his experience, and this guy could have been one of the, just a team member. That might have actually made a little bit more sense, in a way. I don't know, there's just a weird dynamic there about what the IM universe is supposed to be about, and like a whole lot of things in this episode, it seems to be kind of neither fish nor fowl, neither here nor there, and that's part of what gives this episode kind of a bit of a weird vibe for me. That kind of segs me into my next point, which is talking about Greg Morris and the Barney Collier character as a part of this episode. I really love the fact that they brought Greg Morris back for another go on the series. It's obvious that he did this to try and help, his good friend Peter Graves, and obviously his son Phil Morris, and because, this show was such a big part of his life. I'm assuming that, obviously I don't have any first-hand knowledge of that. But anyway, Greg Morris returning was truly excellent. His final scene with Jim was great nostalgia for the fandom. Really, really liked that. Where, he talks about, hey, Barney, you saved my life. And Jim's like, well, Jim says that. And then Barney says, yeah, well, you're too up on me. And, that was nice. That was a really great way to bring, all of that together. Love that. But of course, the real story there is the scenes between Grant and Barney. The one in the facility where it looks like Barney is dying, it was really meaningful. What a fantastic performance. Overall in this episode, but especially there, with Phil Morris. Or for Phil Morris, I guess I should say. The emotion that he shows, you can feel how torn he is about having to leave his father behind. Yeah, he's just so focused on that. Yeah, I got to do the mission, but you know what? He's right there, and we got to take care of him. And then afterwards, after he's forced to abandon Barney and leave him behind, Jim tries to comfort him, and then the conversation, Phil Morris, as Grant shows, a lot of mixed feelings, including bitterness. I can feel the bitterness in his voice. Man, now my dad got taken away from me again because of all of this mission stuff. It's not worth it. He doesn't say that, but that's what comes across to me. And that just feels so real under the circumstances. It truly does. Then even after that, when he gets himself together, he's like, okay, we gotta get through this. His voice cracks. He talks about Solomon appearing at the opera house, and you can see that he's still got that. This is awesome. It really is. And kudos to Phil Morris. I think that this is probably his best work in the series in this particular one. Then there's the final scene where Grant and Barney, Barney's recovering and they just stay together and they join hands. There are no words there. No words are needed. Any words would have just spoiled it. They're just together and they're smiling at each other, and that's all that matters, right? And I've mentioned before that when it's real, you feel it. And I felt it in that scene. Truly amazing. Again, though, there's a little bit of a big mixed bag with Barney, not because of his character, but it concerned me that at the beginning where Barney hands Grant, the scanning device that he's going to use in order to duplicate the bottles that Solomon is using. Doesn't Barney know about the security cameras all around the consulate? It seems like, having been there as a deep cover agent, this is something that he should have known all about. And I think he could have been a lot more careful in terms of doing the transfer to Grant. He could have left the device somewhere. They could have had a prearranged place for it. He could have pretended to drop it someplace instead of handing it off to Grant and, being put in the situation that he was. Of course, that part of the episode is pretty meaningful, and otherwise, the whole scene with Grant and Barney later really probably wouldn't have happened, and so that wouldn't have been so great. But still, it's just kind of weird that Barney would have overlooked that. However, he does redeem himself at the end when, he's with Max and Shannon, and they're preparing to, do the final steps to take down the Golden Serpent operation. When they get down there and they subdue the guards, Barney drags the one guard away, and then he tells the others, let's get to work. Wow. Normally, I would dismiss that kind of dialogue as being egregious. Your mileage may vary on that. But I think here, given the circumstances and given that it's Barney, after everything that he's been through, let's get to work. Let's do this, guys. I found that to be really incredible. I hope you're getting the idea here of what I said from the beginning, that there's such a mixed bag of stuff going on here. There's the good and the bad, and that's why I have to take this review in chunks the way that I'm doing. The next thing, which kind of goes back and forth a little bit, is just about the screenplay, for lack of a better word, of this episode, how it comes across. I think that visually, this episode is really awesome. There's action, in the city of Sydney, at Sydney Harbor, at Fort Denison, which is across from the Opera House. I can just imagine the amount of effort and perhaps money that went into just getting the permits to do the shooting for this. But it's great. I love it. And again, it really gives me a hunkering. Australia is one of the places I've always wanted to go. And this really gives me a hunkering. It's like, boy, it would be awesome to be right there. Some of the ways that they use the environment, yeah, they have to go through some contrivances. They put Max up on Sydney Harbor Bridge. And of course, that whole sequence and the fight with Ball, that's really all about having a cool action sequence. it's pretty apparent by today's standards, watching it today on HD screens, that a lot of that stuff happened on green screens or blue screens or whatever. There were other ways to accomplish what needed to be done here without putting, from a real world perspective, you could do it without having to put Max at risk or danger. But again, obviously the producers were saying, no, we have to make this look cool. And the fight scene on the bridge is quite cool. I think it was well done and well crafted. Moving on to another part of the episode at the end, which is also very contrived for the sake of looking cool, is the final scene where the consulate building where the Golden Serpent's headquarters are goes up in these huge explosions. That is so over the top, so ridiculous. And it all gets started with Big Blonde getting caught in the lasers. And I just wonder, how could you possibly explain that? Did the lasers overload? Did they heat up? All of a sudden, there's a fire and all of this mayhem going on. And it's just really, really, unbelievably ridiculous. I don't know what to say. And other than that, and it's all done for the sake of, well, we have to have some kind of really cool, over the top ending to it. I get it, but that doesn't mean I have to necessarily like it. It's just there for the sake of looking cool and giving the audience something to watch. But you got to do something to draw in the viewers, right? So I guess from that perspective, I do sort of get it. Moving on to the guest stars. I would say that they're all really good. I don't know a whole heck of a lot about them, other than what I find just on IMDb and Wikipedia. Most of these actors, just all of them, I think in this particular case, are, local actors from Australia who have been probably in all sorts of different kind of series over there that I, being in Canada, are just not familiar with. We had Patrick Bishop as Solomon, and obviously also his twin Jehani when necessary. I thought he was pretty good. We had Rod Molinar as Drago. He's fine, although, again, as often happens, the actor's fine, but the character leaves something to be desired. I liked Adrian Brown as Baal. He seems, suitably menacing, and I'll talk more about, what happens with Baal a little bit later. We have a fellow named Max Fairchild as Burroughs, who I think really fits the bill as being, kind of the no-nonsense, assistant to Drago. And then, of course, we have a lady named Nadia Kostic as Big Blonde. I was so sure that at one point, I don't know whether it was in a subtitle somewhere, I looked for it and I couldn't find it. I was so sure that she was referred to with a particular name at some point, but darned if I can find it. So that's who she is. She's just Big Blonde, which is really, really bizarre. Couldn't they have given her a name? They should have given her a name. It's not like they would have saved any money by not giving her a name. Just a final note. The guy who plays Harris the banker is actually a guy named Russell Newman. And I looked at him and I said, wait a minute, I know this guy. And then I said, oh yeah, he's the same guy who was in the episode The Devils as the guy who went insane and whose dreams, Grant was able to extract. Boy, this guy can't catch a break, can he? And this time, he's not even credited, which is weird. So it's an interesting array of guest stars. I think, like I said, they're fine actors and actresses. But then we've got to move on to the whole idea of the characters. More than anything, this episode really, really suffers and is demonstrative of the problem of having multiple antagonists in an episode. I have mentioned it even the first time it was done, back in the original series, Season 2, Episode 2, Trek. And I've commented that when there's, multiple bad guys, usually two, you have to we as the audience have to make a decision about, okay, who's the big bad and who's kind of the lesser big bad? Who do we hate more? And unfortunately, the inevitable result is that one of the antagonists ends up being kind of a lesser than antagonist. This episode is almost borderline schizophrenic in terms of the first part dealing with Solomon and then the second part dealing with Drago. Although Solomon does, he's still there until about halfway through part 2. At first, I was very tempted to go against my usual instinct of what I normally do with 2-part episodes, which is to treat them as one. My recollection was that that's kind of how it was. That, the first one is mostly about one thing, and then the second is mostly about a completely separate thing. It wasn't really possible here because, as I said, there is a fair bit of crossover, except, other than the fact that Drago is really only in one scene in part 1, which is kind of what made me want to, think about it that way. And that is another reason why it reminds me very much of the episode The Council in season 1, or not season 1, season 2 of the original series, where, the IMF is going after this guy, Frank Wayne. And part 1 is about, we have to put Frank Wayne in a situation in which we can, get him and, keep him under our control. And then the second part is using, Rollin Hand becoming Frank Wayne in a very unique way to play out the rest of the episode. And in that one, that episode was definitely much better than this one. Here, it seems to me that is a microcosm of the big problem with this episode, the lack of focus, and which is why, so many of the things that should be really, really good, there's a lot of bad that goes with them. And as I mentioned, more to the point, it really causes problems with the idea of the big bad. We have part 1, which is basically all about Prince Solomon, who is set up to be this really evil character in a sense. We're told right from the beginning that he's a sociopath. He's dangerous. And the opening scene where Solomon contacts Drago and his people, even there, it's just done in such a ham-fisted way. Solomon just calls, they use their cool rings because, again, it's all about looking cool. And then, he says, yeah, everything's on schedule. And Drago basically tells his guys, yeah, everything is scheduled. And he said, on schedule. You'll be paid in the usual way. He tells Burroughs, everything's on schedule. Okay, I'll handle distribution in the usual way. This is not how people talk. This is just a really, really, really unnecessary scene for all the wrong reasons to try and establish Solomon as a certain type of character, which we should see. We shouldn't have to hear it. It shouldn't be from the dialogue. It should be from what he does rather than that. Yeah, that was just really, really lame. Then the bigger problem is, yeah, Solomon does a whole bunch of other things. He tortures Barney and all of this other stuff. And then, though, in part 2, there are moments where Solomon almost seems a bit sympathetic. Maybe sympathetic is not the right word, but now the worries kind of get to him that, oh my God, what happened with his brother and this and that and this and that. And again, it's just the wrong vibe. Are we supposed to forget about all of the stuff that the writers would have had us believe from part 1? That, maybe there's another side to him? Or what the heck is all that about? It's there are ways of going about having a bad guy, do kind of a woe is me routine without appearing sympathetic. It can be done in a way that makes him seem more evil. Think of Barbara Luna in the season 1 episode The Fortune, where she always says, "Oh, they're all out to get me," and all of this kind of stuff, and woe is me, and all of these problems. But again, she does it in a way that makes her look worse. She's more evil. You know, we know that she's not a good person in any kind of way. Here, it almost seems like the writers are playing with it a little bit, and maybe not deliberately. But Seleman almost seems like, not such a bad person, and that's not the right way to go with him. It makes him seem lame. So that gives him that kiss of death. He's not a schmuck. He's not unengaging. He is entertaining enough. But then you have Drago, who is basically a schmuck. The IMF have their way with him in part 2. He's almost a blubbering idiot who just kind of, he talks big, but has really nothing to back it up with. And that kind of necessitates him having a competent henchman in Burroughs. And a very, very, looming and competent henchwoman in Big Blonde surrounding him to make him appear formidable. But if you really, if you dissect it the way I'm doing, and granted, for entertainment purposes, you wouldn't do that, it just means that Drago is not really an effective villain at all. I found it quite ridiculous that at the end, Drago is actually able to hold his own with Max in a fight. That should not happen. It makes Max look weak to me. Maybe I'm overthinking a little bit too much, but I mean, come on. No, Max should not have any trouble, knocking this guy off. And I also wonder where Burroughs was during all of that. He came off the helicopter with everybody else, but I guess he's not worthy to go inside with Drago and Big Blonde. I don't know what was going on there. That's where I really feel that losing Baal at the end of part 1 was really a problem. I know why they did it. They wanted at that point to have, Max be okay, make it sort of a cliffhangery sort of thing. But can you imagine how much better it would have been if Baal had been there at that final fight with Max at the end of part 2? That would have been quite impressive to me. I don't know exactly how they could have pulled it off, but boy, if they could have, that would have been great. The ending basically comes when Big Blonde shoots her crossbow and she misses Shannon. What if one of Baal's throwing stars had hit that button? That would have been equally cool, maybe even a little bit more cool. Maybe there just wasn't enough time, and the writer said, let's put in extra dialogue, instead of having that extra action. I don't think that was such a great idea. I think there could have been a better way to work it. Can't think of all the details right now, so I'm not going to take him to task too much for that. I'll just make some final points about some things that I noticed. The tech in this episode is really neat. The gadgetry is great. Barney having that watch that allows him to dial phones around the Golden Serpent facility, that was really neat. I like that, and the way that Barney used that, to distract some of the personnel at key times, that was great. Grant's 3D printer and scanner is prescient. In 1989, I can't remember exactly when I heard about the concept of a 3D scanner, but I got a 3D printer, scanner / printer. I can't imagine it was more than 5 years ago or so. So in 1989, this was basically the stuff of fantasy, in a sense. But it definitely looked cool the way that device was used, and the special effects that they had to make it look real. That was nice. I really liked that part of it. As I mentioned, visually, this episode is great. But the best part to me was Grant using a tablet to do some fancy 3D rendering of the grotto, of the transfer area. Wow, that was really cool, because I do remember equipment like that. It was cutting edge tech, back in the late 80s, early 90s. I shudder to think of how expensive the computing power would have been to, do, that kind of 3D work back then, but it definitely looked really great. There are some nits to pick with that, unfortunately. At one point, Nicholas picks up what seems was a pretty sizable gold bar, and he picks it up fairly easily. I know that a bar of that size would probably weigh well over 100 pounds. Not that Nicholas wouldn't be able to pick it up, but if it was truly a solid gold bar, he certainly shouldn't have been able to pick it up quite that easily. Last thing I'll mention in terms of like little nits I have, I always hate it when there's scientific inaccuracies in this show, where the writers and producers should know better. Even in wintertime, dawn in Sydney, Australia is 5:30 a.m. Barney mentions multiple times, and others do, I think Solomon also mentions that, the shipment, the transfer will happen at dawn. I know that sometimes people mistake dawn for sunrise, but even then, sunrise in Sydney, even in winter, is like 7 a.m. And then but later, when Max and Grant go down to intercept the shipment, they go down to the grotto at 8 a.m. Well after sunrise. You can see just from the way, the air that in that scene where the sun is and how it's lit, the area is lit. Even after all the talk that it's supposed to happen at dawn, even if they meant sunrise, that always bothers me. If it's supposed to be at 8 a.m., say it's at 8 a.m. It's not really that big a deal to just try and be consistent and have some continuity. Anyway, after all that, what grade do I give this episode? I think I'm going to settle on a grade of a B-, kind of on the border of C+. There was a lot of unfulfilled potential in this episode. And clearly the producers and writers went with the sizzle at the expense of the steak. And I just feel that, it wouldn't have been that hard to, make this episode a little bit more consistent, have some more continuity, put some more meat on the bone, so to speak, rather than just relying on lame dialogue just to make the story a little bit easier for them to deal with. That's just my feeling, and I'm comfortable with that. This has been a long review, but boy, there was a lot to discuss. Thank you all for sticking with it as you do. I really appreciate it. Please like this review video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And please leave your comments about this and other episodes. I'm always looking forward to your increasing feedback. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.